Roncalli's early career at this point as a seminary professor, teaching church history, for which he would get in trouble, or during which time he would get in trouble for using modernist authors in his history course, which we'll see. So last time we were in the middle of considering that that Roncalli was giving a lecture on the death of Baronius, so the third centenary, so 300 years since the death of Baronius. On that occasion, Roncalli is giving this lecture on faith and scientific research. So Cardinal Baronius was a genuinely great historian who wrote the truly monumental work, the Ecclesiastical Annals, which we do have in the library, though that is most definitely in the reference section, given the age of those volumes. But we have it, and it is excellent, even though, of course, it only goes up to the 16th century, late 16th century, or approximately, or the time up to which Baronius himself lived. It is an excellent work, and though we've seen that rather absurdly that Roncalli is trying to claim that Baronius was among the first to employ the modernist historical method to sacred theology, which makes no sense. He doesn't say those words, of course, but it's what he's clearly hinting at, and we'll see just how clear it was to his audience what it was he was referring to at various different points. So he says that, Roncalli's biographer says that although Baronius was the pretext, Roncalli's real subject was the place of historical scholarship in the church in the year 1907, just 4 months after Pascendi. So he Roncalli defended historical criticism and spoke of the wonderful progress that has been made in scientific history in the last few years. We saw all of that. He claimed that Baronius has quite rightly been hailed as the founder of historical criticism. He was asserting that the church had been the first in the field of historical criticism. That very term historical criticism just screams modernist. Whenever you see that, you know right away you're dealing with someone who's a modernist, or at least a modernizer. It's one thing to study your sources, to study your historical sources with a critical eye, to keep track of things that might not quite make sense, but all with the idea of getting the facts right. So it's one thing to read critically in a good sense, and it's another thing entirely to engage in a historical criticism. Those are two very different things. Obviously, everybody who is conscientious when he reads in some sense reads critically, but not in the way that the modernists use the term historical criticism. So Roncalli says, this is Roncalli himself, some scholars, especially in Germany, believe that they have a monopoly of truth, to the great damage of the faith and Catholic truth, as though the Church feared the light that might come from the results of such criticism. Of course, the school of Tübingen in Germany was full of horrible people, and there had also, say, the likes of Immanuel Kant, people like that, Germany, don't forget, was really, in a sense, the birthplace of Protestantism. Not to say that all of Germany was swallowed up by it, but that's where Martin Luther first started agitating, and where, therefore, Protestantism, original Protestantism, first arose, and where also, therefore, liberal Protestantism came into being, and that contributed heavily to modernism, liberal Protestantism. And you see all of that in De Revelazione or other courses as well. That's not really our focus right now, but what really he's trying to do here is make the case that the church is okay with this kind of with this modernism in history, this use of supposed historical studies by modernists. That the church is not only okay with that, but was the first to get there, which of course is entirely false. But the point that the significance of this for us is that it shows where Roncalli himself is. That this is how he wants the church to be seen, as up to date with things. And he will clearly he already has that idea again in 1907. And he would have that idea still in 1962 when he called Vatican II, clearly. He always had that idea, that the church needs to be kept up to date. And you always need to make the case that the church is up to date and wants to continuously update itself to meet the needs of modern man. And even using, if not those exact words, very similar words that are very similar to them. So he claimed that it was the church that had opened the way to this kind of research. He went out of his way to use the now suspect language of renewal, rinnovamento. Remember, it was that same year, 1907, or around the same time at any rate, that the Milanese review with that very name, Il Rinnovamento, renewal, was condemned. So he drew between the late 16th and early 20th century parallels, and made it plain that he considered the general renewal of Catholic scholarship, and that should be Il Rinnovamento, that word got taken apart there, della Scienza Cattolica, a general renewal of Catholic scholarship promoted by Baronius, to be still on the agenda. So he's trying to make the case that the church really is modernist, in essence. That's what Roncalli is saying here. It was precisely this capacity for renewal, quote unquote, that made Baronius a man of his time. Yeah, this is Roncalli himself speaking. We would say today a modern man, in that he had intuited profoundly then the needs, or should be profoundly the needs of the church and of society in his time. So this is consistently what Roncalli is thinking and saying, that we're not going to change anything. We're just going to adapt it to the needs of modern man, and making the case that we're not doing anything really different from anybody else at any other time. That Baronius did the same thing in the late 16th century. That's just what we're doing now by, the agenda clearly being getting rid of the Catholic faith, and that by that means making the church more attractive to people. That was the idea. And ultimately, that was the goal of Vatican II. That was the end that it had in mind, was let's get rid of the Catholic faith and thereby make the church more acceptable to people. And that will bring in huge numbers of people. Yeah, you can hear stories about that. One example of the expectations that were established around the time of Vatican II, a book called Here Comes Everybody. As ridiculous as it sounds, that was the expectation at the time. That this council would just open up everything to everybody would come, and things would be great. The numbers would be bolstered even more by this. Obviously, the most obvious effect was that everybody just left. Had the exact opposite effect. Because the fact of the matter is that the Catholic Church is successful as the Catholic Church. What draws people to the church, obviously, is the Catholic faith. The faith that the church, of course, was instituted to protect and to propose to continue to make more explicit. That is what all of there are, of course, many aspects of the church that might attract somebody, but at the center of all of that is the faith. So it was precisely, he says, this capacity for renewal that made Baronius a modern man, for the 16th century anyway. And Roncalli also spoke of modernism as something that had until recently troubled Catholic consciences, as though something happily resolved by now. So, again, clearly not identifying himself with modernists, but that would have been incredibly stupid on a tactical level for him to admit that at this point, that he was a modernist. He's clearly trying to avoid suspicion, even though there are Sorlitium is definitely onto the diocese of which he is a part, but he clearly has a sympathy for modernists and for modernism. Definitely that. Yeah, ultimately, yes, we'll see, he is a modernist himself, but at this point, he's showing all the signs of at least a modernizer. So he's talking about it as something that recently troubled Catholic consciences. And in this, he does not use the term modernism. He's avoiding even using the term. He's not referring to it by name or to any one by name. But, as we've seen here, this is pointed out by Roncagli's biographer, that he talked clearly about modernism, though without actually naming it, because he did not need to. It was, in other words, this was something that was current at this point. This was something that was, in a sense, the raging controversy in a way of the time. And it was not controversial to anybody, of course, with the virtue of faith. Anybody who is not a modernist, everybody just submitted to and assented to all the condemnations of St. Pius X, the condemnations of modernism put out by St. Pius X. But it was obviously extremely uncomfortable for anybody in the crosshairs, and this is one of the big things happening at the time in the church. So he didn't need to mention modernism explicitly in order to make it absolutely clear what he was talking about. Just, as you could do at any time in referring to any current issue, you don't need to mention names or specific topics in order to make it clear what you're referring to. So you have to keep in mind the setting of all of this. 1907, just a few months after Pascendi, as the biographer himself points out. In the Bergamo Seminary in December 1907, everyone knew perfectly well what he meant. It seems to me that the abandonment of these deep convictions of faith, that is, that history has a supernatural factor, is one of the main causes of the strange movement of ideas which until recently troubled Catholic consciences and caused grave concern. And he says, certain poor deluded souls, I think it right to call them so, judged the church and Christianity by criteria that were all too human. There should be criteria there. By criteria that were all too human. So, he's calling them poor deluded souls, really misled, that is. Misled to an extent. And that obviously is not the way that St. Pius X sees it. Of course, whenever you see somebody falling into error to begin with, you try to bring that person back by means that are as nice as possible. But according to St. Pius X himself, those means have been exhausted by 1907. That these tendencies have been detected and addressed and correctly assessed long before, and that now that the nice ways of bringing people back have not yielded the desired results, now we have to do something else. So he says, thus the illogical and unjust application that German theological rationalism made of its critical conclusions to the traditional doctrine of the Church was an attack on its perennial consistency, no doubt with the praiseworthy intention of saving it. So that is just pure modernism. This idea that it might be a good idea to change the church from within in order to save it. That is the idea of the modernists. Remember, we saw that last year. That was always their idea, that we need to transform the church, that the church needs to be saved from its now outdated self, that it needs to be, again, and Roncalli himself would put it, updated. Of course, he's not saying that this is my agenda or anything, but he's saying, he's really giving a certain, say, lip service to the condemnation of modernism. Again, everybody knows what it is he's talking about here. So he says, yes, that's something that's condemned in it, yes, and it should be condemned. But these people have good motives in doing this. All they really want to do is just save the church. Yeah, clearly he admits by attacking the traditional doctrine of the church. But it's done with a praiseworthy motive. That means that he's clearly indicating a very strong sympathy, to say the least, a very strong sympathy with modernists and modernism. Remember, it's all of this. Keep in mind the end goal of modernism in every form that it appears is to bring about this dogmaless humanitarian religion. And obviously, dogmaless, if you're going to join a dogmalist religion, you have to get rid of the Catholic faith, because that's full of dogmas, obviously. many dogmatic definitions throughout the history of the church. If you're going to join a dogmaless humanitarian religion, you have to get rid of all of your dogmas. No surprise there. So, in other words, the church has to join this religion. The Catholic Church has become part of this religion if it's going to survive, and therefore we must jettison all the doctrines of the church in order to save it. Yeah, they say that you can read the quotations from modernists. The one is I recall from Loisy that the church cannot remain the same. It cannot. It must be transformed from within if it is going to survive. So you can. That was their goal. Again, all of them acting clearly with the idea of doing something good, as they see it, a service to the church, a service to the Catholic Church by rescuing it from itself. And elsewhere he says the remarkable historical period, which, prepared by the pagan Renaissance, started with the German Reformation, is still unfinished at the dawn of the 20th century. So he is acknowledging that, at least, that all of this has a definite connection with Protestantism. Notice that. This remarkable period. Talking about it as though it was something good. Remarkable period. Remarkable historical period. And actually, we're hearing about that currently. It's in the very book that we're having read at table is exactly called that. The history of the church from the Renaissance to, I think it's to the present day, whenever the present day was, at which the book was written. But indeed, the Renaissance, obviously, as we saw, definitely helped prepare things for Protestantism. Just bringing back, remember, pagan culture to a great extent. It was part of the decadence of the time that helped condition things for Protestantism, for Martin Luther's revolt. Okay, so he says the problems which worried the church and the tremendous difficulties which beset it are the problems and difficulties of the church today, except perhaps they have become even more disturbing. So, in other words, never mind. Yes, of course, at the time, during the time of the Renaissance, there were certain issues, definitely. Again, I would say the Renaissance helped to contribute to that heavily, bringing back paganism. Not only, yes, there were certain things about the Renaissance that were good. Of course, there's a great deal of Renaissance art that can be truly characterized as magnificent. But it was also clearly a departure from what had come before, from the art of the Catholic Middle Ages. You can see that very clearly. Without going into the details of it, you can see that clearly. And that was part of what fueled it, but it brought back, again, not only did it result in some very good art and architecture, but again, as we've been hearing, a general interest in everything pagan, including pagan vice. Remember that what can be looked upon as the motto of the Renaissance was Sequere Naturam, follow nature, in the worst possible sense. There's a fallen human nature, all of the vices, the sinful impulses of fallen human nature. Sequere Naturam. And it was due to the problems of the Renaissance period, some of which anyway, was due to at least some of those that Martin Luther reacted. And as we saw that as well, that had it not been Luther, it would probably have just been someone else. He is the foremost of those figures from that period, but he is not by any means the only one. And had it not been he who came to the forefront and led things, then it would just have been somebody else. Because the point is that the conditions were very bad. It's true. There was a great deal that was lacking among, certainly, not to the church herself, obviously, though nothing could ever diminish the holiness of the church, but there are problems with many of her members. That can happen. And it was to many of those problems that heretics pointed as pretexts for their own activities, for the things that they themselves did. But at the same time, the church did, once it became clear that these problems would lead to much worse problems, that there were steps taken to resolve those issues. It's also, it would be unfair to say that everything was bad everywhere. That was also not the case. Every time at every point that we study of the history of the church, every time period, we always look at the problems. The church history is really exactly that. It's more of an apologetics course, or a history of the church history, we call it, but it might more accurately be called history of the problems that the church has had to deal with, either with her own bad members, that's to say those who are in some way defective, her own members who are in some way defective, or external enemies. That's mostly what we're studying. Keep in mind that at every point, yes, there were, the very earliest centuries of the church, it was just all persecution. But at a certain point, you get far enough advanced in studying the history of the church, you have to keep in mind that for the most part, there are at least some places in which things are functioning normally, in which people can just practice the faith normally and live the lives of normal Catholics. That is the case, and that is definitely the case this period that we're studying now. Of course, with Vatican II, everything changed. But that there are, for every problematic spot we look at, there's another spot which, generally speaking, is where things are functioning well and normally. And where, in fact, saints are living. In the worst times in the history of the church, there are saints who help to shore things up to some extent. But even in the wake of all those problems caused by the Renaissance, the church, of course, reacted to that, and there was already a sense, even then, that there's a need for a certain disciplinary reform, and that was one of the things that all these heretics seized on, this need for reform. Everybody agreed that there was a need for reform, but the heretics took that term and hijacked it in a sense and applied it to their own rebellious activities. Whereas the church had brought about an actual reform, disciplinary reform, as distinct from the supposed reform, which means abandonment of the faith, and abandoning of the faith, and rebellion against the divinely instituted church. The church clearly brought about many disciplinary reforms in the wake of all of that. Yes, look at all of the canons of the Council of Trent. Many of them were dogmatic, definitely. That produced some of the most famous definitions of the church. Look through the Denzinger. I'm not sure I have a copy of it here, but if you look through the Denzinger, a great many of the definitions contained in it are from the Council of Trent. And also, in addition to those dogmatic definitions, there are many disciplinary canons as well, many disciplinary decrees put down by the Council, which included, for example, some of the provisions that laid down. One of those was the establishment of seminaries. So there was always a system for training the clergy, but it may have varied from place to place. The idea was we're going to establish a general system of diocesan seminaries to which the clergy of that diocese will go to be trained. So it set that up, established that system. Whatever was in place before was less regimented than that. So, yes, there are always problems throughout the history of the church, but to say that the church has never dealt with those problems, as Roncalli seems to be asserting here, is itself absurd.